blessing of the Lord be upon you.
And bless you in the name of the Lord.
We are on lesson number 74 of the Minor Prophets. And we are in a intermediary stage of our studies. We finished up with Obadiah last week. Is that right? Yeah. And we looked at, really, week before last. Last week we looked at the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC and how Babylon and Edom in particular had brought about that destruction. So we enter now into that period of the exile. And it really goes back to 606 BC and will last till 536 BC, those 70 years. So what we want to do before we get into the post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, we just want to briefly go through the historical accounts that are there and basically use the book of Daniel. We'll look at some things from 2 Kings, we'll look at some things from the book of Ezra. We'll not read all of these passages. We'll look at some parts, especially if you have questions, but we want to get a grasp of what is going on in this in this 70-year period of time, which corresponds to 490 years where the Israelites have not been religiously doing what they needed to do to be right with the Lord. They haven't been keeping the Passovers. They haven't been doing the festivals. They've ignored a lot of things in the law of Moses, and now they are going to pay for it. In a 70-year exile, they're losing the temple, they're losing their nation, but they're going to be renewed to contact to the law of Moses, which contains the Old Covenant. So, to get this in historical context, Daniel is born about 620 BC. Now, why is that important? Because you're in the time period of Josiah, King Josiah. And King Josiah, I believe, as we studied, he began to reign about, was it 632? Let me go back a few. I can find it here quickly. Do it this way. There we go. Oh, 639. 18 years into his reign, he begins his reforms. He starts saying, hey, wait a minute. We found a copy of the law. We haven't been doing things right. We need to get back to doing it. And he starts doing work on the temple. He does away with a lot of the idols and the idolatry that's going on. He's reforming. Well, that's 621. That's when Daniel is born, in that era. So as that work begins, as that Reformation begins, we see a new generation coming about. Of course, in 609, which is, 11 years later, Josiah is killed in battle. And everything starts to fall apart, because the next succession of kings revert back to the idolatry, the getting involved with the nations around them, paying tribute to, first of all, Egypt, and then to Babylon, and the Lord's just, okay, it's over. We're done. But Daniel is a product, so to speak, of that restoration or reformation that was started under Josiah. In 605 BC, well, really we would go 606 is when Babylon comes in, and that's their first invasion of Judea and Jerusalem. So they come in, they attack, and they take a good number of the royal family back to Babylon. And Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, now that's not their names at first, take them back to Babylon, which is also called Chaldea, there to teach them how to be good Chaldeans. So let's go to Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So that would be 606. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar and to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. The king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, used without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge and understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. If you want to change somebody's culture, what do? You change their language and you change their literature. Okay? Why are people always trying to destroy the Bible? Get the Bible out of schools. Okay? Don't go to church. And why are there so many churches that you don't study the Bible anymore? Because they're trying to change the culture. Change the language. How many people are familiar with the language of the Bible? And I'm not talking about Hebrew and Koine Greek, or even Latin in the Catholic Church. I'm just talking about pick up the Bible and read it and understand it. So, why? Because the secular world is trying to change culture. Right? Verse 5, the king assigned them daily portions of food, that the king ate, the wine that he drank, and they were educated for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called, he called Shadrach. Mishael, he called Meshach. And Azariah, he called Abednego. And that's how they got their names. So, that's those first 7 verses that we went through. But that tells you what happens in those first, gives you that what's going on with Daniel. So he's about 15 years old when he's taken. And, he stands up. In 602 BC, that's when the third year is completed, right? But in that third year, in those 3 years, what does he do? He stands up. He says, no, we're not going to eat this food. And we're going to keep our language. Yeah, we'll learn your language, but we're also going to keep our language. We're going to continue in our literature. We'll learn yours, but we will keep ours also. He doesn't fall into that where, okay, we're just going to accept what you say, and that's it. Here's a question. Remember when we were talking about cognitive dissonance? Was that last week? Okay. Here's a better example of cognitive dissonance. Theistic evolution. Okay. Theism says God created the world in how many days? 7 days. But the evolutionist says it took thousands and thousands, millions of years for it. So somebody says, well, I see that, so hey, let's mix them together and say that, well, those days are millions of years, which now you've got a cognitive dissonance, right? You're trying to accept something that can't logically be brought together, all right? Now here's the question. If we believe the Bible, should we study evolution? Why should we study evolution?
It gives credibility and facts to the creatism.
Because in studying evolution, we can point out the faults of it, right?
It's just like your enemies. Study your enemies.
Know your enemy, right? So, what is Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego doing? All right, they're saying, we'll study this, but you know what? We're not going to accept that culture offhand. And that's an important lesson for today, isn't it? We're not going to accept that men can have babies. Okay? We're just not, that there's more than one gender, or more than two. Okay. And again, it's how do you define gender? Okay? And if they want to and go out here and say gender, the biological sex is male and female, okay? And I understand there are some at birth that have both genitalia, okay? But typically there's a decision made, all right? And as bad as we can feel about that, that's not a feeling, okay? And the problem with gender assignment, so to speak, is a feeling. And then the things they do because of feelings is the problem that we have in a culture today. And we need to just stand up and say, no, it's not about feelings. Okay? Lance, if you were a doctor and I came to you and I said, you know, I feel like I've got lung cancer in my right lung. Will you take my lung out? Would you do that?
Without looking,
What do you mean? Look, I feel like I got lung cancer. Please take my lung out. No, you'd run tests, and after you run the test, wait a minute, there's no sign of cancer there, but I feel like I've got it. Feelings can be wrong. Look at scientific evidence. All right, off the soapbox now. But getting back to that, at what point do you stand up and say, here's truth, here's truth? Well, what was the truth that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were standing up for? There's one God who is the creator of everything. And all these other gods are false gods. And that's where we get into this lesson in between. And that's a lesson that the children of Israel, the Israelites, had to learn. There's one God. All these others are created. And when you went out to the hills and the mountains and you worshiped there and offered sacrifices to those gods, you were insulting the God of heaven. And when you brought those idols into the temple, you were insulting the God of heaven. So, let's look what happens. In 602 BC, they complete their training. But if you look at Daniel chapter 2, verses 26, come on, there we go. And I've got 26 there, but if we go back, in the second year of King Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. That's in chapter 2, verse 1. It's 3 years. Now, Nebuchadnezzar becomes king, but in the second year, he has this dream. And Daniel interprets this dream. Do you remember what the dream was?
That's where the fat cows eat skinny cows. I can that mixed up with another one.
I think that's Pharaoh.
Okay. Okay.
I was thinking the statue
It's the statue.
that have the different types of minerals or whatever you want to call them.
Right. So, if Nebuchadnezzar is the king, and it takes 3 years for them to complete their training, all right? But it's in the second year that Daniel interprets the dream. He hasn't completed his training yet, has he? It doesn't seem like, okay? But Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. He sees, in this dream, he sees a statue, a head of gold, chest of silver, belly of bronze, legs of iron and clay, all right? And he brings in his Chaldeans that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are training to be, right? Tell me what the dream is and what it means. Well, you tell us what the dream was. If you're really mystics and you're soothsayers and all of this, you can tell me what the dream is and then tell me what it means. Well, they couldn't do it, so he's going to kill them all. Daniel's, I can do this. Well, I can't do it, but the Lord will tell me. So he interprets the dream. And he basically saves the Chaldeans, and that's in 26 through 45. And of course, it's about the future, right? It's about the future. The head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian kingdom. The thorax, so to speak, is the Medo-Persians, right? The belly of bronze is the Grecian Empire. Philip of Macedon, and then Alexander the Great. The legs of iron and feet of clay, that's the Roman Empire. Those things are going to come back later on, and you'll see it in history. But he interprets the dream. He tells him what the dream is and interprets the dream. That's in the 2nd chapter, right? In 589 BC, Nebuchadnezzar begins a siege of Jerusalem. See, these are the things that when I was looking at it, I thought I thought the dream would be later. That's after the destruction of Jerusalem. No, this interpretation of the dream was before the destruction of Jerusalem in 580. It was before the second invasion and siege and the carrying away of more people. But when Ezekiel goes to Babylon by the river Kibar, But I think we even talked about that, 2 Kings 25 verses 1 through 3 last week. Okay? But you see the time frame of what's going on. Any questions on this so far? You see what we're using? We're using Daniel as the historical account. Okay. Then in 586 BC, the third invasion, the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. And we talked about that in 2 Kings 25 verses 4 through 10. But remember, they destroyed, but who do they use? The Edomites, mainly. And then Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue. Wait a minute. He had a dream, didn't he? About a statue. And now there's another statue. Now what's this one about? This is chapter 3. But again, it's 586, and it's in chapter 3. It doesn't really give us a date about it, I don't think. But chapter 3, it's about the fiery furnace. Daniel's promoted because of what he does in chapter 2. But anyway, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits, and set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And basically what he does, because he has destroyed Jerusalem, he sets up this statue. He says everybody's going to worship that statue. What is this? It's like a national religion then, isn't it? Everybody worship this statue. But when he sets it up, 3 people don't. Now why isn't Daniel included in this? I don't know. Daniel may have been off doing something we're not really told. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down, worship that statue. But if we're looking at this in the historical context, this is what scholars say. This is when this happens, after the destruction of Jerusalem, right at that time, after the destruction of Jerusalem.
Hadn't Daniel found favor?
He's found favor.
King no,
Mm-hmm.
I have spared him.
But do you think Daniel bowed down? I don't think Daniel would have bowed down either. There's some reason why Daniel isn't in this. But it's just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that are thrown into the fiery furnace. You see what I'm saying? But we're not told. We're not told why Daniel. But I'm sure Daniel would not have bowed down either. Okay? But that's in chapter 3. Now, date-wise, in 563, 562 BC, Nebuchadnezzar loses his sanity. And in that, what is it, 4 months? Is it 4 months he loses his sanity? It's in chapter 4. It says, all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar at the end of 12 months, okay? And because, now, we're going to come back to this in a moment. There's kind of a gap But this is the date of it. 563, 562, Nebuchadnezzar loses his sanity. Does it say there 4 months?
End of days. Verse 34, when it says he's restored at the end of the days.
Eat grass like an ox in 7 periods of time. Maybe it's 7 months. I think it was 7 months. So for 7 months, we'll say 7 months. How would that be? 7 periods of time. Unless it was 7 years. It's 7 periods of time then. He loses his sanity, he goes out, he's like an animal. He eats grass, his nails, his fingernails grow, his hair grows, and he's like an animal. And finally he looks up and gives praise to God, and his sanity is restored. We got that pretty much correct going down through there. In verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol the honor of the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. So the humbleness comes after what?
7 periods of time.
Yeah, but it's after he builds this statue and says everybody must worship it. And that's the point I'm trying to get to in this. Yeah, he's kind of after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're not burned up in the furnace. He makes a statement, worship the God of heaven too, but now now it affects him personally because he loses his sanity, he goes out, now he comes back. And thankfully, maybe, just in time, because what happens in 562 BC down here? He dies. 562. So this is, if 86, this is 24 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. Right? And when he dies, there's a succession of kings, I believe. But these kings don't last very long. And then in 553, or in 556, 6 years later, Nabonidus becomes king of Babylon. This is from secular history here. All right? 3 years later, Belshazzar is appointed his co-regent. Now, Belshazzar is his son. Nabonidus makes Belshazzar his son, the co-regent, and he's in the capital, but Nabonidus kind of goes off and does whatever he wants to do. It's kind of like he might be over here at the Winter Palace or the Summer Palace or whatever, but he kind of leaves everything to Belshazzar. And that's the downfall of the Babylonian kingdom, Babylonian Empire. It's at this point that Daniel has the vision of the 4 terrifying beasts. In Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 through 7. Now notice, it's like there are 3 chapter 5 and chapter 6, they're missing, right? It's what it seems like, but they're not. Because what's happening is Daniel has this vision here. He doesn't record it until chapter 7. Does that make sense? Any questions on this? But again, there's near unanimous consent that in this vision of the four terrifying beasts, what do these represent? Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. Right. In 548, 547 BC, Daniel has another vision of a ram and a goat. But this is Daniel chapter 8. Now you notice you had chapter 7, chapter 8, and if you go to them and look, it's in this particular year of, and this particular year of, but they're down in chapter 7 and chapter 8. But they happen time-wise back here. And the vision of the ram and the goat, what he's talking about here is what we refer to as the Maccabean age. Okay, and you've heard me talk about the Maccabees. That's the time period between Malachi and the New Testament. All right, the ram with the two horns stands for the Medo-Persian Empire. Two horns, right? Medo, the Medes, and the Persians. Two horns. What are they doing? They're just tearing up everything. All right? And then there's a goat that comes along, and the goat has what? One horn. At first, well, that's Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great just basically conquers almost the whole known world at that time. Everything from Greece eastward. Okay? But then comes up four little horns. But when Alexander the Great dies, like he's 32 years old, tries in a drunken stupor because what? He's young and he's conquered the world. He's got nothing left to do, right? So he drinks himself to death, and what they do, they divide the kingdom into four parts. And that's going to be the history of that region where Judea resides, the Seleucid area. All right? And that's Daniel prophesying about that. Okay? But that happens in like 48, 47. Well, Belshazzar is this co-regent. He's been appointed by his father. And he's there in the capital, and he's a playboy. What do I mean by a playboy? He likes to have feasts, and he likes to have the dancing girls. And well, Daniel chapter 5, he says, I'm going to have this feast. He invites all his friends over, and they're partying. And hey, go down here to the treasury and get the vessels from the temple in Jerusalem. And we'll drink out of those vessels. We'll get those cups and stuff, you know. And that's what they're doing. They're partying 539 BC, right? Have you ever heard of the handwriting on the wall? Meeny, meeny, tickle you first. Means you have been judged and found wanting. Your kingdom will be taken away from you and given to another who is more worthy. Basically along those lines. And that's in Daniel chapter 5, verses 5 through 29. Of course, the hand writes it out there and nobody knows what it means except Daniel, who at this time is 81, let's see, 20, 61, yeah, he's about 81 years old. But they've forgotten about Daniel. And his mother has to tell him, you forgot about Daniel? Daniel could probably tell you what this means. And of course, Daniel comes with the bad news. You've been judged, you've been found wanting, your kingdom's gone, and it's going to be turned over to somebody different. That very night, Cyrus of Persia invades. They dammed up the waters of, I believe it's the Euphrates River, maybe it's the Tigris, but they dammed up the water, and the water that protected them like a moat, the Persians come in, destroy, and kill Belshazzar and take over. And now there's a new king, a new emperor, and a new kingdom. It's the Medo-Persians. Okay? Cyrus is of Persia. He's the big guy. All right? But he appoints Darius the Mede as viceroy. Don't confuse him with Darius the First, Histapes, who's later going to be the king when they start, when Haggai comes along. All right? But he appoints him as viceroy. In other words, here's the emperor, Cyrus, but over this little part of Babylon, Chaldea, he appoints Darius the Mede to be the viceroy. Does that make sense? So he's like a king of this little kingdom here, but he's not the big guy. All right. So, moving on. So Darius, who knows what has been happening, because he's a Mede, he's been there, he plans to elevate Daniel, to make Daniel and maybe even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego rulers over certain areas of Chaldea, the old Babylon, okay? And that's in verses 1. Administrators revolt. That's the Chaldeans, the elites of the Chaldeans who have survived this attack, and they say, we don't want a Jew or these Jews ruling over us or even with us. So they convince Darius the Mede, Darius, here's what you need to do because you're very important now. You need to make a decree that for what, the next 30 days, nobody pray to anybody but you because you're so important. Because Cyrus has made you the king of this area. So he issues the decree, right? And they know that Daniel, what's he going to do? He's 81 years old, right? He's not going to stop what he's doing. He goes by the open window and he prays to the God of heaven. And what do these administrators do? They run to Darius the Mede. Hey, look. Didn't you make this decree? Nobody's supposed to pray to anybody but you? Look at Daniel. Look what he's done. And then he says, boy, I stepped in at that time, didn't I? I put yourself in his shoes. I issued the decree. I didn't think ahead what might happen. I don't want to do this to Daniel, but I have to do it. You go back and read the story. You see it there. He throws him into the lion's den. And Daniel is protected. Then you have Darius' decree to fear the God of Daniel. All this is happening when about 539 BC. But look at, so that takes you to chapter 6, right? Down through to chapter 6. Chapter 7, he relates. Here's this vision I saw of what? The 4 beasts. And then chapter 8, here's the vision I saw of the ram and then the goat. Chapter 9, you get some more stuff there, but chapter 10, what's happening? Daniel mourns the indifference of the exiles. What's that mean? How many people of the Jews who have been in exile now, some of them maybe for 70 years, I know some generations have passed. How many of them have given up and said, let's just do what they say? If Darius the Mede says, don't pray to anybody but Darius the Mede, okay. Let's just pray to Darius. And, you know, maybe we just won't pray to anybody. Maybe we just won't pray. Maybe we will give up about going back to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. What happens if they give up the hope of going back to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple? What else have they given up? The hope of the Messiah. Because he has to come to Jerusalem. He has to come to his temple. Daniel mourns the indifference of his people. Can I ask a question? How many times do we mourn the indifference of our brothers and sisters in Christ? They just don't care. They just seem to have given up. Worship means nothing to them. Bible study means nothing to them. Okay. One more. All of a sudden, somebody tells Cyrus, hey, do you know that you were mentioned in some of the Jewish, Judean, Hebrew prophecies? What? And it was mentioned back there that you let them go back and rebuild their temple after they were in exile. To show him, you're right. And in 538, that's a year later, what? I issue this decree that these people can go back to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Then in 537, it takes them a year to get everything ready. About 50,000, it's 49,000 something, but around 50,000 returned with Zerubbabel, who is going to be the governor. They go back to rebuild the temple because 70 years are about to expire, right? 536 BC, Daniel dies. the age of 83 years. It doesn't really tell you that, but he goes his way. He goes the way of his fathers.
Lived very long, did he?
84 years. At that time it is. At that time it is. He dies in 536 BC. They go back, they start work on the temple. The temple is completed in 516 BC, and that's where, now, this is going to bring us up to the time of Haggai. So when we start with Haggai, we'll do some more little historical understanding what's going on there, okay? But you'll see Haggai writes in 520 BC. They go back, they start work in 536 BC. But they quit. They quit. And in 520, God sends them Haggai and Zechariah. Tells them, get off and get to work. Time. Questions? I know we've gone through this and it seems quick, but it hasn't been. I wouldn't do this if I didn't think it was necessary so that we get that chain of what's going on. This is not a once upon a time story, fairy tale. This is history. And when we understand the historical connections to it, you know what that does? To me, that makes it real. It hit me when looking at, boy, a lot of these things that were happening to Daniel, that the visions that he was seeing happened really early in his life. Some of it before 600. I knew it was 605 when he was taken, 606, whatever, but wow. What a prophet he was. And what he went through, what he stood for. It's amazing. Next week we'll start Haggai.